Welcome to this meeting of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. This morning's session is the long-planned hearing on the work of the BBC, part of our regular scrutiny of the corporation and ahead of the launch of the Charter Review. We're joined by Dr. Samir, Shah, who's the chair of the BBC board, and Tim Davie, its Director General. Welcome to you both. This is the first hearing in Parliament with the new Select Committee, although we were hosted by you both at Broadcasting House in November. But in addition to that, do any members have any interests that they wish to declare at this point? Tom?
Shah of the BBC APPG.
Thank you very much.
Ex-staff member a long time ago.
Okay. Anyone else? No? Okay, thank you very much. So our aim for today is to focus on long-term sustainability, vision, strategy for the BBC. Then we're going to get into some more operational matters. Now, I think you probably will share our frustration that, as so often seems to be the case for these hearings, we're going to find ourselves discussing the latest scandal to have hit the BBC and the latest crisis, which is not where we would want to be as a select committee. But unfortunately, you must be as frustrated as we are by that. But we will have to come to those issues, including the recent issue over the Gaza TV programme, because they do raise significant questions about the BBC, but we're going to come to that a little bit later. We're going to discuss the editorial decisions, the Gaza documentary, behaviour standards. But before we do that, I want to start by focusing on the fundamentals at the BBC, the issues of charter, the issues of the licensing fee and the case for public service broadcasting. Dr. Shah, you came before our committee the last time for your pre-appointment hearing, and you may recall that you left the committee with just a few qualms about your willingness to answer some of the questions, because obviously this was before you took up your post. So what we really want to hear from you, we wanted to hear from you 3 months after you got appointed, if you remember, but then the general election got in the way. But you've had almost a year now in the role. And so we really hope that you'll be able to be robust and frank with this committee now about your view on some of the big picture questions that we want to put to you, particularly about how the BBC is operating. But we do have a lot of questions to get to. So if you can both be direct and pithy and concise and in your answers, that would be really, really helpful for us. So Dr. Shah, I'd like to start with you, please. As we move in to the discussions about the BBC Charter Review, the BBC is facing a number of challenges, not least about its returned income, around increased competition for audiences, the range of digital and technological advances, how people consume news and their viewing habits. In all this context, is there still a case for public service broadcasting? Is there still a case for the BBC?
Chair, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I will endeavour to answer your questions. As it happens, this is actually the anniversary of the first. I started a year ago today.
Well, happy anniversary.
And I hope the short answer to your question is, not only is there a case for the BBC, the case for the BBC is even stronger than it has ever been before. If you look at the competition that's around, and there are lots of challenges, don't misunderstand me, and I'll talk to some of the challenges we have. But it seems to me, as I've looked over the last year, the case for the BBC is huge, and I'll break it down to 3 different sections. The first and most important is news, and the arrival of misinformation and disinformation. And the fact is, when you leave it to the market, opinionated news is what happens. And that's why it's so important that the BBC is the place to find fact-based journalism. I think in society, not just in Britain, but in the world, there should be a space where people can be assured that you have fact-based journalism which is impartial. That is even more true now than it has ever been. And I think when we come to discussing the world service, so that's a really important part, because we're not acting alone. There are other actors, like Russia and China, trying to spread their information, which is really important. So the importance for the BBC to be the place for fact-based journalism is stronger now than ever before. The second area, if you look at, and there's been a lot of choice, and a lot of programme, much of it is very good. Let's take, the streamers, and let's take one of the most popular bits, which is drama. Now, the streamers' drama tends to be aimed, for perfectly good commercial reasons, to a global audience. The BBC is passionate about making programmes that tell our story, the British story. We have amazing dramatists in this country who write and tell our stories. The BBC is the only organisation that can focus on British storytelling for a British audience because we are paid for by the British people. And the third area, which is now increasingly distinctive, is bringing the nation together. You wouldn't turn to Netflix for a collective experience, but we can provide that, and we have done, whether it's in terms of programming like Gavin and Stacey, always the coronation. We collect the nation. So these three things, which Tim has very well articulated, I think make the case for the BBC and indeed for public service broadcasting as a whole.
Can I ask you about your role as the chair of the board? These challenges that the BBC face, and you've articulated the vital importance of the BBC, but the challenges that you've articulated, in some cases they're quite existential about the very future of the BBC with regard to its charter review and its sort of place in the world. But at the same time, there are these ongoing operational issues which we'll come to talk about later. It requires an enormous strength from the board, but particularly strength from the board's chair. Now that you're a year in, do you feel that you've got what it takes to be able to offer that leadership?
Well, let me tell you how I've approached the business of being the chair. This is a very big, complex organisation facing a number of challenges at different levels. The way I've seen it is at the very highest level, the BBC is undergoing a huge transformation from being a broadcaster that's delivered programming through channels, what we call a legacy channel, to a digital broadcaster where you deliver things on demand. This is in response to the changing way people are consuming content. This is a very big strategic change.
I'm asking about you. I'm asking about you and your role as the person who really needs to grip this.
Yes.
Now, I mean, the BBC is a world-class organisation, but it's got a phenomenal reputation.
Yes.
But that reputation needs to be guarded every single day. Can we be sure that you are the right man to steward it through these very choppy waters?
Okay. It's a good question, and the way I've approached it is I've asked for a board effectiveness review that was carried out a few months ago by Chris Saul, a very distinguished figure who's done much of this. And there, one of the questions he did ask the rest of the board and the executive was my own performance, myself. And it's come back. You could ask him, but I can send you the data. But it came back with what I would say a great endorsement of my chairing of the BBC. So I think that
okay.
Nothing is ever perfect, and I'm making some changes. I can talk more about the changes I'm making, but the overall statement was that it was very supportive. The senior independent director, Sir Nicholas Sirota, also said to me that he talked to all the board, and they were very supportive of the way I've chaired the organisation, the way I've conducted myself and the job and role of the board.
And what has been the biggest challenge that you've faced as chair so far in this last year?
You mean in terms of strategic challenges or personal challenges?
Well, either. Let's have both.
Okay, all right. Well, I tell you, the personal challenge is quite interesting because I began, it's an interesting point there, because I began by saying our job, the board's job, is to hold the executive account. And when the papers come through, I tended to go straight to the questions that the board have about what the executive paper is on, whether it's about what we're doing about the East Bank or whatever the stories are. And there was a feedback that this was slightly began in a rather too aggressive a tone, and that we should let the executive first of all lay out what went well as what didn't go so well, and then we can. So I think that was managing the board to make sure we gave the executives the time to set out their stall before we went in and challenged them. I think if you were to sit and watch any of our boards, they're pretty challenging. I don't think Tim can answer that. think the executives do feel that they're given quite a run for their money. And maybe I took the business of we need to hold them to account a little too hard, and I've just pulled back from that. At the bigger level, if I can say, I was talking about that there's a top level of transformation, and we mustn't underestimate how that flows to the whole organisation. To go from channels and analog to digital is a huge change. At the everyday level, there is the whole constant vigilance and impartiality, which we may come to. I think I have personally taken on board the whole question of the culture, and then we can talk more about that. But I've been asked a lot, well, what are your specific strategic priorities, Chair? And I have three. One is, and first is viewed through the lens of independence. I want us to secure a charter for a generation. I do think that it's important that the charter protects the BBC's independence, and we can talk about why I think it should be a generation. The second is we need a funding model that provides us universality, because that's a really defining point of our public service mission.
What do you mean by universality?
Well, I mean that everybody in the country should have a stake in the BBC, not just the subscribers to it, and not to, it should be accessible to everyone, and it should be used by everyone, to certainly, not completely, and we do well on that, but those are my two criteria for universality. And the funding model, however we work on it, we can go into more detail about that, because we've done a lot of work on that, should deliver on those. So there's charter funding, and the final thing is I'm really keen on decentralising the BBC. I think it's important that we move power out of London to outside, let's say, the M25. I think it's really important because the public, when you do our research, don't exactly feel the BBC reflects their concerns, their views. They don't recognise the BBC in that way, and we do need to tackle that. It goes back to universality. The BBC has to reflect the country as a whole.
Okay. We're going to push a little bit more, I think, on the future of the BBC. We're going to start with Tom.
Thank you. Good morning. We can ask a little bit about how the public might gain a greater sense of ownership over the BBC. Dr. Shah, the Culture Secretary, said that mutualisation is something worth exploring as part of the debate over the BBC's future. What do you think that would look like in practice for the BBC?
Thank you for the question. I think that's exactly the question. What does mutualisation look like in practice? I think the basic principle that we should have greater audience involvement in what the BBC does is absolutely right. There are issues. I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure how mutualisation works for the BBC. We're looking at it, we're examining it. The principle is a really good idea. There are issues here. People say when it happens that it gets taken over by activists, if you have that. And so that's an issue. We need to guard against that. But I do agree with the principle that should find ways of engaging our shareholders, our licence fee payers, with the business of the BBC. I mean, part of that we're going to do is, of course, as you know, we're going into a public consultation about what the public wants of their national broadcaster, and Tim is very much across the details of the questions we're asking, and that might begin to throw up. There've been other ideas, citizens' assemblies. There've been lots of different mechanisms by which you can encourage involvement and engaging. I think that's a good thing to do. We should do it. I mean, they pay for us, so it's quite right that we should hear them and listen to them and act on what they say to us.
You mentioned potential, say, for activist takeover and
Yes.
various mutualisation models, and talked earlier about protecting the BBC's independence as part of charter renewal. Do you think that if there were direct elections, say, for representatives to the board, do you think that could politicise the BBC? Because it seems to me that decisions by ministers to appoint former number 10 advisors to the board have damaged perceived impartiality, and this could risk it further, but you might disagree.
Well, I think these are important questions, and when we discuss the new charter, we really should talk about appointments to the board and how the process by which those appointments are made strengthen the independence of the BBC. To me, the most important thing is to maintain the independence of the BBC, because that's where our reputation rests. And I think that appointments to the board, I'm not suggesting that the BBC board should not reflect the concerns of the country. I think they should. And I think the political establishment should have all of you represent people within the country, and you have a right to have a view on the board. But I do think we should look at the process and how we can strengthen the process and make it more independent.
Sure.
Sorry. What's that doing there?
And sorry, I don't know.
Hang on, turn it on. Sorry, go on.
Beyond perhaps direct elections to the board, what other ways do you think it might be possible for the BBC to improve the public's sense of ownership of the BBC?
Do you want me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you about this. I mean, I think, just to go, I think the case for the BBC is stronger than ever, but the jeopardy is higher. And firstly, into the building blocks here is what we know is that in terms of support for the BBC, it is based not wholly on aren't we good for you, but are you used? And that, Chair, is why we said universality is not just about access, it's about usage as well. That's why I am obsessed with the fact that, factually, 84% of people used the BBC last week and 95% used last month. So the first thing we can do in terms of have a participatory BBC, and I am actually worried about the participatory nature of our society as we speak about it today. Do people feel involved? Do they feel involved? And the BBC has to be an essential, independent body where people can feel involved in civic society. The stakes are high. The first answer to your question is the best thing we can do is involve them in watching, listening, engaging, debating, and be part of our process. And the thing we've all got to worry about is people disengaging from that completely. Then I think we get to a set of mechanics which we're working on, which there's almost a ladder, isn't there, of different involvement you could have. Whether you can have comment boards all the way up to... There's lots of ideas in the air. Whether you had, specific accounts where you have, education we could make more personalised, all those things. You feel closer to the BBC and you own a stake in it. We own a lot of IP. We may touch on IP. We all own the BBC's IP. How do we make that apparent? And it may not be just a co-op mutual model. I'm not criticising that, but it might. What I do agree with is we do not want any tokenistic measures and measures that frankly can be, we know that shareholder meetings don't often have all shareholders involved.
Yeah.
And I think your concerns are valid.
But it seems to me that the people who are most likely to say participate in, if there were direct elections to the board, would be the most engaged.
It is without doubt that when I spend time of a Friday evening, the people who come with most views and share their perspective on the BBC may be those who are actually more, what we might call a core audience, and I love them to bits. But actually, if we're interested in the whole of society being engaged, it's important that every mechanic is either representative or brings in those people who are on the edges of maybe our civic debate, and not just those who want to be most involved. And I think that is a central challenge to the ownership question. We all agree that building a link to the BBC and feeling ownership of it is important.
Thank you. And I guess moving on slightly to funding, and the government said that funding of the BBC would be discussed as part of the Charter review process. What was your instinctive reaction to the linking of the two? Was it predictable, frustrating?
Linking Charter to funding?
Yeah.
Well, I think in principle what the Charter should establish is what the purpose and mission of the BBC is, what it should be doing. And I think once we've decided that, we should then say what's the best way of funding that. That would be the way we should do it. Now, in the real world, we've got 3 years to sort both things out, and they probably will exist in parallel. And they are, in some cases, 2 separate instances, sometimes they're together. But we'll have to work with what we have. The logic says let's decide what the BBC is for and what it should do, and then how to fund it. But in the practical world, we're going to have to engage in both discussions over the next year and 2 as we get to the final moment, which will be January 28.
So your perspective, working out what the public and other stakeholders want the BBC to be for comes first, and then the funding model follows from that.
Well, that would be the logic of it, but I think we're going to have to work on both fronts at the same time.
Sure. And there's been speculation in the media about the government's thinking on BBC funding, notably about general taxation. Have you had any conversations with the government about the breadth of funding options under consideration?
I mean, we've had first discussion and saying these are the various options, and we've had a constructive discussion with DCMS in terms of which you'd expect. There's no rocket science here. Here are the options, and I do agree with the conversation that we just had, which is it's really important to say what do we need to deliver and what will that cost? Because we're in a global marketplace in terms of funding content. So, the head of drama in the BBC has to find 30 plus dramas a year. That has a price tag attached, and we've had significant money taken out of the BBC, 30% out over a decade. We have to decide what we're going to do with this public service operation we've got, which is world-beating. Now, within that, your point is absolutely right, which is, or to answer the point, sorry, we are having a discussion which says, okay, here's the models around the various parts of the world, here's the options you can look at, whether it's household tax, whether it's fees, and there's all kinds of things I've talked publicly about the need to, we believe in the BBC we need to reform. We don't believe we should just sit and defend what we've got. That's a really important point. We do not want to sit, we believe that reform is needed, but I've talked about the level of progressiveness, the scope, the enforcement, all these things need to be put, and we're having those discussions.
Are there any models you'd want to see come off the table, funding models?
Well, the chairman wants to talk about this.
Sorry, I missed the question.
Are there any funding models you wouldn't like to see?
Yes, we have.
Advertising subscription.
Yes, we're absolutely clear that advertising subscription is not the right approach. It goes back to universality and back to that, that old phrase, who pays the piper calls the tune. If it's subscribers, if they're paying, then they're going to call the tune of what we're going to make. If it's advertisers, it's advertisers. We're certain that the people who should call the tune are the public, the British public, the licence fee payer. And that's why it needs universality. Now, you could get that either through a reformed licence fee or other mechanism, but it's really important to us. The BBC is to remain the BBC as we know it, a public service broadcaster. It needs to be universal in its sense of mission, and therefore it should be owned by the British people.
On general taxation, do you have a specific view on that? We've obviously seen quite difficult spending decisions in the past week made by the government, and is there not a risk that further difficult decisions would be to come if the BBC was to be rolled into general taxation funding, that there would be competing pressures and increased political influence?
My understanding is that we read that general taxation has been taken off the table. We would be sceptical because that gives us, I think it allows the government to have too close a say on it. We'd like it to be slightly more independent, so we're not thrilled by the notion of general taxation, but I'm pleased to know it's now been taken off the table as an idea.
It feels like a reformed licence fee remains the preferred model from your perspective. I guess the final question on that then is, there's been a fall in the number of people paying the licence fee, and that trend seems set to continue. How would a reformed licence fee, whether that's in terms of how it's paid or the enforcement, how would you see that reversing the decline?
In a minute, actually, Tom. Yeah.
I will defer that.
Yeah. Okay. We'll hold on. We'll hold that thought, and move to Damien.
Thank you, Chairman. I was going to ask one question for now, if I may. So maybe that Tom wants to come back on the licence fee. I just wanted to ask about commercial income. So obviously your organisation has a very, very enviable stock of IP from the mother brand to individual pieces of creative output. So there has been strain on licence fee income. But I think the bigger drop last year was in commercial income. Bigger drop,
yeah,
I think, was in commercial income. So I wonder if you could say a little bit. That's probably a question for Tim, a bit about how that came about. But a question for both of you is what is to be done about it.
Sure. We've got ambitious plans for the commercial arm, and I'm very proud of what's happened. If you look at I'll come to last year, but if you look at the track over the last few years, we've doubled the business. We've got 2 billion turnover. In 23-24, by that point we'd returned 1.9 billion to the licence fee payer back from that commercial arm. It's the envy of the world, this business, by the way. And to have grown it in the way we've done with services like BritBox, getting distribution rights, dare I say, to Bluey, and these deals we've been making, very innovative, and actually grown that business rapidly. There was some minor headwinds, I say minor headwinds, in a market where there were major headwinds in terms of our overall revenue last year, but profitability still nearly 200 million. The challenges of the commercial business is a little bit apples and oranges in terms of the shape of the revenue and the money. So as I've said before, I think the licence fee as constructed currently, we're going to come on to that debate, is 3.8 3.9 billion, of which it costs 100 to 200 million to collect. And then I do not have to make a P&L work on that. I just have to make you get good value for £169.50. The commercial arm is 2 billion revenue. It hits its EBITDA or cash margin targets, but that's about a 10% margin. It also contributes a bit of return. So all in, you're at 300 million. Now, what I would say about the commercial arm going forward, I'm confident that we can grow the business. There's opportunity still. In the areas you're talking about, our IP, we have a fantastic franchise, is the word today, isn't it, which is called BBC News. We're investing on building a expanded bbc.com. We're ambitious. And we welcome the increased debt facility that we've got on that business because it wasn't very geared, which is important. The issue with this is there is a tension that I sit across, which is how much we take from the commercial arm in dividend to support ensuring the licence fee offer versus investing in the business long term. And I would say that tension is growing because you are essentially having to move a business and transform it into the digital age, and that requires a lot of capital. A lot of the businesses a lot of
businesses struggle with that balance about reinvesting in the business versus.
I'm not moaning about
dividends
it.
for
I'm not moaning about it. I'm just
Yeah.
saying it does not mean you've got an absolute. Even if you grew double the commercial arm, it would not utterly transform the position we're in with regards to public service funding. That's what I would say.
Yeah. And where do you see within the commercial income streams? Where do you see the most promising lines of growth?
Firstly, we are beginning to migrate from old school linear channels, which have been kicking up money, to the obvious, which is digital service. So BritBox in the US is now over 4 million subscribers. It's pretty much very low churn, and the enterprise value is very high. The deals we've got on IP, like Bluey, are generating very serious return. We have put more money into production, audio production, so there's plenty of areas of growth.
Thank you.
Sorry, going back to the licence fee, and we were just talking briefly before we changed topics onto the level of return you're seeing from the licence fee, the number of people currently not paying it. I guess looking at evasion specifically, what specific measures are being implemented to combat licence fee evasion, and do you feel they're working?
We've got very significant efforts, and if you were to visit Darwin, you'd see our retention units and the various. We've got better data now that we can deploy. We've seen some progress this year, which I think we'll forecast to see less erode. We'll see a bit of erosion. And by the way, there is not a business model of a traditional media business that isn't seeing significant erosion in its model as we move from limited choice to infinite choice. Having said that, we have the vast majority, I think we're 24 million licences in circulation. That we will see licence fee revenue go up this year, up revenue, but number of households will be down, but I don't think it'll be down as far as the year before. But it does not, there's no complacency there. I think there is a question longer term which relates to the scope of the licence fee, the value of it, all these things are material in terms of what retention you get. But we've got a sophisticated and an impressive operation in terms of revenue in the BBC. What we do know is it is clear that the case for the BBC in terms of societal case, I think, is stronger than ever, but it remains at the licence fee level quite transactional. In other words, if people feel they're getting value for the licence fee, they may have all kinds of views, and believe me, they do, on the BBC, its output, but by and large, the communities we need to keep in to the BBC and to public service broadcasting are those that feel that they don't get enough, they're not viewing it enough. And that is what we're working on.
And may I just add to that about no licence needed? I think we need to be clear there are two bits of that. There are people who are using that as a reason to evade paying the licence fee, and there's a genuine group of people for whom they do not use the BBC services, and where that might not have been a credible position 15, 20 years ago, it is credible now that there's so much choice that you don't use the BBC. This is why the licence fee needs to be reformed. The trajectory, we know, I think we've done very well last year, and so we've managed to hold it up, but there's a trajectory, which is why the licence fee needs reforming. It needs reforming both in terms of its scope. It has reformed. Over the years, it's reformed its scope. What does it capture? I am myself persuaded that we need to make it more progressive. I think it's just worth thinking about that. It's an issue. And also, we obviously need to enforce it, but I am troubled by the idea that in today's world that not paying the license fee is a criminal offence. I think that's not to say that we don't need enforcement, but I am troubled by it. And these things, whatever our reformed license fee, needs to address those points as well. So it is quite an important point that, as Tim says, we are keen to reform the license fee to make sure that we meet these things, plus create the scale that we need to deliver our mission.
If the evasion of the licence fee is 11% at the moment, how high does it have to get before that undermines the universality of the BBC?
I think there's two questions, isn't there? That there's the usage and the funding. So the first thing in terms of undermining universality, I think the biggest thing is usage. Then you work out how do you charge against that usage, to be fair. And as I said, I won't repeat the numbers on usage, but I think we've had an exceptional year, and thank you to my teams for delivering the numbers in terms of usage, because off that then you can then charge. I think legitimately say to people, charge. Remember, I don't have a figure which said at this particular point. What the chair has said is exactly where we are, which is we need a system that, for starters, a lot of that is just straight evasion. And when we research with the vast majority of people, they say, actually, we want everyone to pay because we're paying. So there's a small amount of people, and it is small, who are not using, but the vast majority of that could be evasion. Therefore, I think we need to be clear about scope, enforcement, all those things to ensure that as many people are captured. And there is, over time, of course, the data improves through digital usage, all the things we can do, but we're not quite there yet. But I think that will help us in terms of ensuring that we capture and get the income that we should be getting.
Yeah.
Have you done any modelling on what kind of progressive licence fee would look like in terms of keeping the same income for the BBC? Mr. Shah, you mentioned you're tempted by a more progressive model. Have you looked at how much that would generate in terms of at the higher end? I'm assuming you charge wealthier people more, but charging less well-off people less. Have you done any figures on that?
There's been quite a lot of modelling done on that. But
we've modelled pretty much everything. So, I mean, it reminds me of one of those old school graphic equalisers, if I may, where you could charge a bit more here, you could do what would be the implications of we currently fund over 75s on pension credit. If I may, one of the biggest questions we've got going to licence fee is what we pay for and what government pays for. Remember, for many decades, the World Service, which we may well get to, was paid for by government. And also, if we do these concessions, that was paid for by government.
So, to answer my question, what have you modelled how much income you would get? Could you increase the income the BBC could get under a progressive licence fee?
Yes and no. Sorry, I'm not being evasive. It's just how much progression you give and what your charging is. But do we have those models? Absolutely.
And could we see some of those figures, some examples from the BBC?
We can give you the factual. We can give you those figures.
Yeah.
The issue is what's acceptable and what the public want. So the figures is relatively easy. The question is what is the right balance that ensures the licence fee or whatever emerges from it is good value.
And have you modelled what decriminalisation would look like? Dr. Shah, you mentioned
we have
decriminalisation. You said you're tempted by that. What would that look like in terms of income?
Well, didn't we give you these precise numbers? It'll cost us, if we decriminalise. This is a modelling exercise, and my understanding is between 200 and 300 million a year. So it adds up to over $1 billion in the course of over 5 years.
It does depend.
That you would lose.
Sorry?
That you would lose.
We would not get. Yes, that's right. And so, I mean, what I was saying about that is.
Sorry, Chair. You just said that you can see merit in that as chair of the organisation.
As merit in
it not being a criminal.
Well, no.
So
what I said is it troubles me that it is because it feels.
I mean, it's a binary situation, though, isn't it? It's either criminal acts or it isn't.
We need some form of enforcement, otherwise people won't.
So you do want enforcement for it?
I think we must have enforcement, but I think that we need to think about how that enforcement can be done. There's been obviously questions of should it be a civil a civil matter rather than a criminal matter. Civil matter has its own issues about what happens at the far end of it if people don't pay, the whole bailiffs thing. I'm not suggesting there's an easy answer here. I'm simply saying that when I hear people saying that not paying the license fee is a criminal offence, I just feel uncomfortable.
You're the chairman of the BBC. You're troubled by the idea that people are criminalised by not paying the licence fee. You're troubled by it, but you're not a commentator. You're the chair of the BBC. What's your solution to that?
Well, if there was a simple, straightforward solution to it, if you could just say, don't worry about enforcement.
I'm not suggesting it's simple. What is your solution at the moment?
Well, we don't have a solution at the moment, but I'm saying that when we discuss the funding model, this is where I'm putting it, when we discuss the new funding model, we should make enforcement part of that debate and discussion.
But do you have a view that, I mean, so, Dr. Shah, when you recall when we met you a year ago
Yes.
in the predecessor committee, the one thing that troubled us was that you were reluctant to opine one way or another on a whole range of issues. One of the questions we asked you, quite straightforward, whether you felt it was appropriate for members of the board to be members of political parties.
Yes.
And I think as a committee, we would have been satisfied with either answer. We would have agreed or disagreed with you, but we would have been satisfied if you were able to sort of substantiate a viewpoint, but you didn't articulate one. You were unwilling to come down on either side of the fence. And this is what we're hearing again. I think what we want from the chair of the BBC is some strong views. Whatever those views are, we want to know what they are and why you feel that way. But you equivocate on virtually everything.
I hear what you've just said here, and I have obviously, as Tim has said, we've done a lot of modelling of different kinds of enforcements, and they cost us money. And if it is the case that we can get the government to make do, because we need to create a quantum of money for the BBC to do its job. Let us say it costs £200 to £300 million a year. It's not in my gift whether the government will make that right. Now, if they don't make it right, I can't just say this is what we want. If they don't, it's got to be a debate and a discussion.
It's remarkable as chair of an organisation that you don't come out so strongly in defence of there being a righteous cause to pay the licence fee because it's value for money and all the other things that you'll spend time making the case for renewal. But also in considering the sheer volume of cash you need to raise to continue, that you start with an equivocation that might lose you 200, 300 million, your figures, a year in lost fee paying. I think it's extraordinary. If as the chair of the BBC, I would have thought you come out and you bat on any wicket for the BBC. It's not your view to... I mean, you can have a view on it, of course, but it's not your role to give a sense of what is or isn't troubling at the end of a judicial process for people not paying something that they're supposed to pay. You're giving very mixed signals.
Well, okay, I'm sorry you think I'm giving mixed signals.
No,
but
but if you start an innings behind 200, 300 million pounds a year, that's a lot of money to make up.
Let me give you not mixed signals. If the government were to take back the funding of the over 75s, that would save us several hundred million. If the government were to take back paying of the World Service, that would save us a few hundred million a year. So that's not in my gift, but if they were to do that, then the ability for me to say, let's not criminalise the offence, we would be able to make that happen. Now, it's not in my gift to do that. There are many other calls on the licence fee, S4C, other things. Now, if that money was taken, it wasn't our responsibility, then we would have the money to cope with that phenomenon of criminal enforcement.
Can I just say one...
We're also discussing, for example, charging businesses. So it's an equation. If we can get enough movement on the licence fee or reform licence fee that we can we can get that kind of money back, then the idea of taking off enforcement becomes realistic.
Hold on.
So that's what I'm really saying.
In the interest of time, I want to just move on. Damien's got a question for you. Then
it's just an unexpected turn to this conversation because this topic has come up in this committee before, and there's usually been members of the committee saying, and it is true that it's a bit of the licence fee situation is a bit of an outlier. There are particular questions about the number of women who criminalised and so on because of it. But still rather unexpected to have you saying that. But I just wonder the extent to which technology possibly changes this story anyway. So in the olden day, we were just having a word about TV detector vans, such as they were. But these days, I mean, if you can enforce at the point of use that people can't access the content unless they have paid, presumably that changes the enforcement scenario in the future anyway.
Well, I think firstly, we want the licence fee enforced. End of. And most people want the vast majority of people paying expected to be enforced. And all we're debating here is the right mechanic to enforce. And we have had some challenges in the current system, as you will with any system, because no one around the table's got the perfect system. That's the one thing, if you look through the various reviews of BBC funding, everyone, to be fair to says the licence fee is not perfect, but actually we think the licence fee is the best system we've got at the moment. Okay? So what we're hearing is that debate here. And the point here is that I do think we as the BBC have to have heavy enforcement. And by the way, the other side of it, heavy is probably could be a misrepresented word. Effective, thank you. I'll take your word, thank you. So effective enforcement. Wipe heavy from the record. Effective enforcement. We know that in the imperfections of the licence fee around some of, women alone in the household, we've done a lot of work on this. There's only so far you can go on that. We also, no one wants anyone, and they don't at the moment, but in any way the dominoes falling to be an imprisonable offence, all those things. Having said that, when we look at things like civil penalties, you get to bailiffs, you get all kinds of questions. So I think we are a long way from jumping to a new place. What I want to just build to is the point that's been made, which I think is a very important one. In the short term, within a charter change, bluntly put, I've looked at what you could get on the data side, and there is definitely potential over time for a more rational, precise enforcement system. The answer through technology. The answer is it's going to take a bit of time.
Right.
So you just can't get there on the charter renewal. But longer term, I think we could chase an area which is much more rational, which is you use the BBC, you can see it. And
just one final point in terms of progressive. I think it's a strong argument, but presumably you start on the basis of everything that's currently being paid for continues to be paid for. The progression is who else can pay a bit more than they currently are. Or are you suggesting that it starts at zero again and some will pay less or none?
There's that argument which requires some debate, and I've been misrepresented. Tim Davie wants to charge more. I'm not leaping there. In terms of progression, one of the things the current progressiveness is about those who are struggling with budgets and struggling at home with their household budget, like over 75s on pension credit, get a free licence. What I have said is historically, and I think it was a mistake, that was paid for, that's been put on the BBC.
Comparably, though, and I say this as a champion of the BBC as well, celebrate the role that it plays, wishing actually that it was a bit more front-footed about its existence, because you have a situation where there's not a comparable per monthly spend for the people that you're talking about.
You don't have to convince me
that we're great
value for money.
So why aren't we hearing that? Why aren't we hearing that from the leadership of the BBC?
Well, I think
why is it forever on the back foot? Why isn't there a front-footedness to the value for money argument and how much you pay per month and the lack of comparable membership fee? You can't get a Netflix subscription for that equivalent. What's more is actually, as somebody that wants to be able to download your material, I can't, but I could pay a bit more. But that doesn't exist because you've not yet caught up with technology that's existed for 10, 15 years elsewhere.
Well, okay, I'm going to bite on the last bit, then I'll come back. I am hugely proud, actually, that pretty much uniquely as a local media company based outside the US or China, we have fantastic digital products and download. You can download it on the iPlayer. That's part of the deal.
You can't on a computer. You can on an iPad. You can't on a computer.
The overwhelming. It's a rounding error on computer now. With respect, it's those other devices you can download on, and that's all part of your license fee. It's a fair challenge to personally my job to get on the front foot on the BBC, and now and again, as you know, we have numerous, as referred to the chair, top things going on the BBC. I think we are being front-footed about it. I mean, I'm talking all the time about the value. If you talk about your licence fee communication, if you look at what we're delivering, what I would say is overwhelmingly it is about behaviour and usage, and then you do what you're talking about. But if you haven't got the former, it's no good telling everyone we've got all this stuff if they don't use it. And we are obsessed by that. You know, well, this is what the research is telling me.
Right.
And I take your challenge. We'll be as front-footed as you like, and I think we're actually on manoeuvres on that.
Great. Thank you.
Good, thanks, Jim. Tom?
Moving maybe from sources of income to streams of expenditure, what's happening with your spending on high-end TV to compete with the global streamers, and does that result in difficulties on the amount you have to spend on content for other genres?
Significant challenges, and in some ways we are defying gravity. As you know, we have lost, in real terms, we've lost a lot of our income over the last 10 years. Currently, and I'm thankful for it, we're in a 4-year period of CPI. The problem, of course, is high-end television has been, as you know, inflation has been beyond that. So the answer to your question is that is probably one of the main preoccupations of the executive team in terms of how do we ensure that we preserve local services, preserve all the various things we think are so valuable to the BBC, but also we know that when people, linking directly to the earlier conversation, when they look at how they ascribe value for the licence fee, if you ain't got those big dramas and you ain't got those big moments, you don't get there. So the short answer to your question is we are working extremely hard in a couple of areas. Funding, working really hard in terms of co-production. We've done that for years, but we're having to work extremely hard to do that to maintain 30 plus dramas, our natural history and all the things we're doing. That is getting increasingly difficult, and at the edges we're beginning to see some real challenges, particularly around very high-end drama pricing, which is the Peter Kaminsky, Wolf Hall, you've heard it here. Yeah, that is where, so there are a few titles, they're not overwhelming, but if I talk to my content team, it's not lists and lists, but there are a couple of titles now where you go, sorry, we can't get to the £5 to £10 million an episode. I would say we're not out of the game. We're not out of the game, by the way. We're doing very well. We're the biggest. You think Blue Lights, you think all these shows. They deliver great audiences, and not everything has to be a 5 to 10 million budget. But that is getting more tense, and it does put pressure on other areas that don't quite deliver as much audience impact. But that's the job. The job for the top team is to make those choices and ensure we're on the front foot delivering the value.
So you talked about what you're doing in terms of co-production, and we're trying to do there. What could the government do to help the BBC make more high-end British drama? Well,
I think we've just got to keep looking at, we're very appreciative of the tax credit regime.
Is it high enough?
I'd like to, you're talking to someone who makes television programmes, so of course it's not high enough. But I think the threshold numbers could go, comedy, there's a number of areas where with the government, I think, look, we need to nurture this industry. And the BBC is one set of discussions, but we have huge issues beyond the BBC. One of the things I'm worried about is, when I'm visiting many of the cities and areas around the UK, we're often the only show in town. And we've got very significant unemployment among freelancers. So we're going to have to do more to continuing to attract investment. And we've got the skills, not all the skills, but we've got the craft heritage, we've got people who can make these programmes. We need to drive more volume in.
What about streamers, Levy?
I'm open-minded to it. Sorry, the reason I'm sitting, I just need to see exactly how that works. I'm going to actually meet Peter Kaminsky very shortly, actually, I'm going to talk about it. I think the idea that contribution is flowing back into the UK is a good idea. Just exactly how that works and where it goes, I think it requires a bit more debate.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Tom. Rupert?
Hi both, and thank you, Tim, for putting me in touch with BBC Bangla. I went and had a look there in January.
Thank you for your visit.
They did say they want more money, inevitably. So just conveying that request to you.
Well, for most visits I make as well.
So after that, I went on every national network. So that was the start of something. I became a minor celebrity for a couple of days there. My question is about international stuff, actually. And I know the chair said we shouldn't make this all about the scandal over the documentary last week, but I guess there are questions to be asked. It was in Parliament on Thursday. There was an urgent question on it. So, Samir Shah, you've been head of current affairs and you've also run an independent production company. It's right that this thing didn't meet editorial standards. I just wondered what went wrong, and when it's a production company as well as the BBC, what's the chain of accountability then?
Yes, well, as you rightly point out, I have a lot of experience in current affairs documentary making and indeed to be an independent producer. So I would say that right from the start, the moment this story kicked off, Tim and I have been in constant conversation about precisely those questions. What went wrong? How and why did it go wrong? And what are we going to do about it? Those questions started literally day one following transmission of that program. And I asked Tim and his team to write a report for the board answering those questions. And there was a very speedy piece of work done where that report came to the board last Thursday. To my shock, I think that we found that there were serious failings on both sides, on the independent production side as well as on the BBC side. And in the statement that we produced from the board, following what was quite a robust, candid and open discussion, addressing those questions based on the paper that was been pressed to us, that we acknowledged that there were failings on both sides, and we now need to move to a stage of what actions are we going to take. What we've now done is to ask for a further investigation, because remember, the first step was an interim report. Now we need to talk to people directly, find out why, what are their answers to it. We need to do this properly. But I am surprised. The question I would say is that the processes, the editorial guidelines and the standards that the BBC has are very good. They're very strong, and I know because I've receiving under them. So I have a worry that it wasn't so much the processes were at fault as people weren't doing their job. That's what we need to really establish. Why do?
Things.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, is there also a danger that I suppose the question is the accuracy of the film. So there might also be, conversely, a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The thing's been withdrawn from iPlayer. Obviously, transparency was lacking there. So, I mean, there's also this letter going around, I think originally 500 media professionals, now 1,000, who've said that it was an overreaction. You could delete, edit or put the health warnings in, because this was a kid whose dad had that job title, and I don't know if it's in some of these regimes. I know with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, from having constituents there, and I know from Bangladesh having roots there, that to be a doctor you had to be in that party. Right. So we don't know, did this individual have prior warning of October the 7th? Were they involved? Do you know what I mean? It could be that...
I'll ask Tim to answer some of the detail on that. But I'll ask him to answer the detail. I want to make it quite clear that the idea that we see that what's happening in Gaza through the eyes of children is a good documentary idea. It really is. It's a good. When I was in current affairs, my Gaza, as it were, was Northern Ireland. And if somebody said, let's look at the troubles through the eyes of the children, it's a good documentary idea. I do not want anybody to think that's not the case. What we're talking about is the execution of that idea and the level of trust that took place between the BBC and the independent production company. And I'll let Tim pick up on that.
Yeah, I think, firstly I'd say nothing's more important than we're trusted. And you know, we have actually built trust over it. So you can imagine that I think there's a lot of frustration and disappointment. It's not about the BBC and people like myself, but we're very sorry to the audience because we don't want to be in a position where we have flaws in the programme making. And overall, I am proud of the way we're covering some of these polarised, fiendishly difficult events where many of our journalists, as you know, are under enormous pressure, ferocious lobbying, and it's been extremely difficult. But in this case, there are flaws. When you know, people say to me, well, you had to have external challenge. We do get external challenge. I get external challenges reported on from various institutions and other people questioning our programming. And it's appropriate. I'm editor-in-chief. And if someone says, you've got a problem here, it's quite right that I go and ask the teams and say, have we got a problem? And dig into it. In this case, we got challenges, but
Organisations were
various
on you.
various
Can you tell
challenges.
us?
But well, I think overall we had it depends what you call. Sorry, I'm not being evasive. I think on the log this morning there was about 500 odd complaints about the film being biased against Israel. We had about 1,800 wanted to put the film back, but then we had some serious complaints from various parts of the, we have various complaints from different people in terms of, and various organisations in terms of their concern about this programme. There were specific concerns, as you know, and we've been highly transparent in my view in terms of, and that's how I try to deal with these things, in terms of saying there was a specific question around, but bear with me, around the father of the boy. And as we dug into it, we've been totally transparent, we found out that we were not told. Now, to your point, you can debate the materiality of that, you can talk about, but in my view, if you're asked a number of times and that question was not answered, and from our side, and we have fantastic teams, by the way, and I certainly think under the pressure they're under, you've got to understand some of these situations, but the level of curiosity you ask, is there anything more I know? That is basics, and at the end of the day, as editor-in-chief, I have to be secure, not only editorially where the film's at, but the making of that film. And at that point, quite quickly, I lost trust in that film. Therefore, I have took the decision quite quickly to take it off iPlayer while we do this deep dive. That's what's happened.
So it could come back after editing.
I'm not.
I'm not. Questions of accuracy.
I'm not
and
ruling
coercion.
anything. I'm not ruling anything out. What the chair has said is actually right. Is do I think this is a valid and
was it accurate? Was there coercion involved? Those kind of things.
That is why I think we've done a good first initial bit of initial work that tells you more than enough to say tells me more than enough that there are flaws. But I want to do a forensic analysis of. There's a lot of things floating around in terms of budget, all of those things. We want to make sure we've done the forensic analysis of the process, the editorial, and do the work.
Dr. Shah, you spoke about it being a question, or asked whether it was a question of people not doing their jobs properly. Can I just ask you, is that a reflection of the staff of the BBC in general? Is it is something fallen through the gaps between the BBC commissioners and the independent production company? Or are you talking about it reflecting BBC staff choosing to be lax when it comes to reporting of Gaza?
It's nothing about the staff in general. We're looking very precisely on this particular film and the decisions that were taken, at what point they were taken, and when and how the process of compliance took place, and whether people did or did not follow the compliance rules to the letter. And that's what we're now digging into, to find out exactly what happened, why it happened, because I know the compliance rules are really tough. We do have to comply. We don't just sign something off without interrogating it. I've done it myself, and therefore the question arises, and we need to. Let's be fair, we're talking about human beings here, and they need to have a right to answer the questions, to be talked to find out, so that before the board discuss what is the appropriate action, we need to hear from everyone about it. And that's what we need to do. But it is, I would say it's confined to this programme, and there's a wider question, which I can think up to, about the BBC's coverage of the Middle East in general. I think that's an important question. We've had, as Tim has said, we have loads of complaints about our coverage on specific programmes or in general, and it seems to me that this warrants a proper independent review of our coverage as a whole. That takes us beyond this story. But on this story, we're examining how and why the compliance to editorial rules did not take place.
And Ofcom wrote to you yesterday on this
Yes.
matter. They basically said that they feel that they may need to step in to facilitate this investigation. Can the BBC mark their own homework on a matter as sensitive? like you say yourself, trust matters.
Yes.
Trust is absolutely integral to the BBC. And actually, a film like this has huge value, but we have to be able to trust what we're seing and understand
right.
the provenance
I think
of it.
Ofcom's letter, and I welcomed it. I think they asserted that it is for the BBC to investigate first, and if that's not satisfactory, Ofcom can then move in. That's the right process. Now, marking your own homework, we have literally marked our own homework on Thursday, and we came out with a very robust statement that there had been failings on our side as well as the others. So I'm not sure that the phrase marking your own homework necessarily means that we don't do the job properly. Peter Johnson, who's been tasked with doing this, did the Russell Brand review. It was an excoriating piece of work, and we marked our own homework. We do it. BBC First, as a first system of actually doing it, is not in itself a bad thing. And I think Ofcom's position is right. If they're not satisfied with the way we've conducted it, perfectly right, they have the right to investigate further. But let us do our job. We will do our job, and I will ask the committee here to trust me. The board is very exercised about this, seriously exercised about it, and we will get to the bottom of this and we'll take the appropriate actions.
James. Hold on once. No, just once. Yeah, go on, Ripple.
There could be questions around the whole coverage of this war. Is that within the remit of the Peter Johnson inquiry?
No, sorry.
I mean,
this is a separate.
I think there should be scope.
Well,
for something
I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you.
Stuff about from day one when was it the ambassador or his head of mission, because it's not an actual country. Dr. Zomlot was on TV, and the question was always, "Do you condemn Hamas? Do you? You know, people have evaluated these and measured."
Let me be clear about what I'm saying. There's a piece of work to do with this particular film, Gaza. I think there's a very important piece of work to do about the way the BBC has covered the wider story of the Middle East conflict. That needs to be done independently. We call it a thematic review. We've done one on tax and spend, where Andrew Dilnot was the lead figure. We've done one on migration, which I was part of before I took up the post. And I think this is such an important topic that I feel very strongly that this should be the next one we study. And it should take in, because please do understand, as Tim said, we have been, we get a lot of complaints and accused about all our comes from all sides. It's not just comes from one side, it comes from all sides. So we do need an independent review of how well we've done this. Have we done it impartially? And I think that's quite a big piece of work, and wants to be done.
Okay, we've got the message. Thank you. James.
You've had to make a value judgment in removing the film from iPlayer. So is it right you don't agree with the 500 to 1,000 artists that have said that this breaches regulations on regulatory, legal and ethical obligations because you've removed it in the first instance? So you disagree with that argument?
No,
that they're making?
well, this one to me, and it was a very difficult decision.
Okay.
Because I think representing some of the views, this is stories we want to tell, and this is a very hard situation for us. Bear with me. So, and also we have got a rich and important current affairs history in this area where we've got programmes we're very proud of. And it's worth saying this documentary maker has got a great reputation of making some fantastic documentaries. The issue, I don't think we're in breach of anything, is editor-in-chief, very simply, if I can't trust the programme, it's nothing to do with one side or the other. And this is where it's being misrepresented. It really is. And by the way, if you think we bow to lobbies from either side, come and spend a day with me. We don't. We try and navigate a course sensibly, rationally, based on fair, balanced journalism, and everyone has a view on it. What we did, and I did, and it was a very tough decision, was to say, at the moment, looking people in the eye, can we trust this film? In terms of how it was made, the information we've got, and that's why we made the decision. It's a simple decision in that regard.
But why is it a retrospective decision?
Because we had new information.
But the BBC, according to to show some even-handedness on questioning wise, the BBC repeatedly raised concerns about the child's family links to Hamas. I mean, I would, again, that's not marking homework, that's credit to the independence of your news organisations.
Absolutely.
But why weren't those suspicions not properly investigated or reported? There is a requirement under Section 19 of the Terrorism Act to do so, and shouldn't the counter-terrorism police now be investigating whether BBC funds have reached Hamas, either through payment to the father or the sister, as I understand, has also received money?
Yeah, let's segment I need to segment the issues there slightly, which is that first decision was not related. Payments were not the thing being debated at that point. That it was a simple fact of the relationship. Yeah. So there was nothing at that point. I did not need information on the payments. It was enough to say that we had asked about. Remember, the question was, is there a relationship with Hamas in any way? And to the point, you can talk about the looseness of the relationship, but that should have been declared. Yeah. And to your point, transparency was lacking. Exactly right. And at that point, I look people in the eye and say, can we trust this film at this point? Not is it a valid area of journalistic endeavour. It's not a criticism of the wider newsroom. It is absolutely, can we trust this programme? That's when we take it off iPlayer. Okay. Then you say, okay, let's have a look. Let's look in detail at this. Let's look at the funding. Now, it's worth saying that, just to be utterly clear, the BBC has only made, as I understand it, I want to make sure that I'm safe, bluntly, because we need to do this deep investigation, but as I understand it today, the BBC's only made one payment, which was for a licence fee to the programme maker, the independent, to make the film. The initial assessment of the economics, and we need to do the detailed work, showed that there was a small payment to the sister. Because the boy, and it's totally normal payment, which is the boy recorded the narration and went to a studio to do it. Okay? Now we just need to understand how that works. We are very, very clear about our obligations in terms of the law and what parties we have to. I don't want to get into too much detail, as you would understand, but we do not need any prodding. My view is absolutely clear, is if we've got obligations to make sure everyone is aware. And by the way, what we're aware of is in the paperwork that we've issued in our statement, and absolutely everyone should be aware of that, including any authorities that need to be. We don't need, I mean, that's absolute transparency. That's where we are.
Do you think you will the scope of your inquiry confirm if the money paid for the documentary ended up with Hamas?
Part of the work is to do a forensic analysis of exactly what happened to the money. Yeah.
But are you asking that question?
Of course. Of
Okay.
course. And it's
So
worth saying,
the
the independent production company, to represent them fairly, they have written to us very clearly that they say no money has gone to Hamas. But we absolutely have to do that work, and the answer is yes, of course. As far as you can go. I mean,
it's fair to assume if the family of a senior Hamas leader is paid, that money goes into the...
Let's deal with the facts. Assuming anything at this point, I'm telling you the facts I know, and that's what I can stand on. And I've told you what I know, which is a limited amount of money was paid to the sister, is what I am being told at this point.
And given this situation, referring back to my former question, if trust is of the issue here, and people are calling into question whether the BBC can be trusted on this issue, is the BBC the right person to be doing that inquiry?
Well, when you think the review we'll be doing is, I think we have a very good process. And the first thing is, I have fast-tracked the review out of news, which is a really important point, to Peter Johnson, who has outstanding credentials, by the way. He ran BBC Northern Ireland, which I would say requires a degree of navigating the current affairs course that is quite demanding. Peter has an outstanding track record reporting directly to me, and we fast-tracked that to what we call Stage 2, sorry for technicalities, to the ECU. That then is right that he does a full report. And then we've got Ofcom. We have an independent regulator as per their letter, so exactly as their letter outlines. So I believe that is a proportionate and right response. Separately, as the chair has said, and this is a matter for him and the board, is we do have thematic reviews which stretch beyond one particular affair, because this does then leak into bigger allegations around the BBC's coverage. of which, to earlier points, we have vociferous views on either side of this conflict, vociferous views.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that I would welcome, it's absolutely right that as a public service broadcaster, we have independent oversight against it. I mean, part of what I've tried to do for the BBC is be a guardian of true impartiality through thick and thin, and that requires being completely transparent. So I think there is the right moment. Being blunt, I think the challenge is often the time you do that in, if you've got journalists in the field and all those questions. But we're absolutely committed. The board have been very clear with me that they want to have that independent review, and I welcome it.
Okay, Damien, and then Paul.
Thank you. Dr. Shah, you said the board is very exercised about this, and I'm not surprised. I mean, from the point of view of the BBC's reputation, this is awful, and today more than ever for a similar case if it had happened in the past. I mean, you yourself talked about the distinction between opinionated news and fact-based news. I think later in this session we may come on to talk about the different sources that people now self-select their news from and the brand flattening effect. And you've both talked about there being failings both at the BBC and at the independent production company. The failings at the independent production company matter not to the people of Britain. I think they're called Hoyo. Brand awareness in Britain of Hoyo, 0. Brand awareness of the BBC, close to 100%. It is with you. You are the trusted source. So my question is, given that Hamas are in administration in Gaza, I mean, presumably things that happen there have their say-so, regardless of the identity of the father of this child who was involved. And therefore there must have been a whole series of questions. The question really is, did you have questions that were unanswered, or did you have questions that were answered incorrectly by the production company? And in any event, given the sensitivity of the situation and given the nature of administrative control of Gaza, surely on the precautionary principle, until you had full comfort on those types of questions, the thing should not have been aired in the first place.
Are you asking me to answer
I'm
that?
asking either of
Okay,
you.
but let me first of all agree with you that this is a really, really bad moment. What's been revealed goes to the heart, is a dagger to the heart of the BBC's claim to be impartial and to be trustworthy, which is why I and the board are determined to answer the questions you've just asked, because that's what we're trying to do here. Who did know what? And you make a very good point about the film itself, and slightly addresses Tim's point about losing trust in the content of what we saw because of what you've just said. This is why we need to do a proper deep dive into the mechanics of the filmmaking itself. Now, my experience is in Gaza, but I know that when we've made films in Northern Ireland, we had to be very careful about the circumstances in which the terrorist organizations worked and how they controlled things and what we did. Really important. So I think what you're asking is absolutely right, and what I want to reassure the committee is this is exactly why Tim is deep diving into this, because we will find this out. And you're quite right. In terms of, it's the BBC that needs to come out of this. Whatever happens with the independent production company, what matters is we need to restore trust in the BBC. And we need to get to the bottom of this so that we can begin that process.
You're a filmmaker yourself, a programme maker yourself. Would the BBC normally risk their reputation by subcontracting the due diligence of something as important as this to the independent production company?
It's another really good question. I think that the independent production sector is a highly experienced, very mature, developed group who do lots of really quite difficult programming. This particular company did make a very interesting, and again, a difficult program in Ukraine. And it was a very, I don't know if you saw it, I can't remember the name, Enemies in the Wood. Very fine piece of work. So there was every reason to think that they could do a good piece. I'm not involved in the commissioning. We look at things after they've been commissioned and transmitted. So I'm not suggesting, and certainly I'm not suggesting that independent production companies aren't capable of doing.
But my question is that the normal system and process that you would subcontract the due diligence?
We don't subcontract in that way. We contract, and then to answer the question directly, there are unanswered questions. So
when you say there are unanswered questions, as in there were questions from the BBC?
From the BBC that should have been followed up and answered. Okay. This is not a process. There's plenty of process here. And this is on this. I 100% agree. The audience out there, at the end of the day, this is about trust in the BBC. Yeah. But we don't. The editorial control. At the end of the day, the editorial responsibility for anything we publish is on the BBC. Yeah. Having said that, you can explain. If you're in my job, you want to understand why the failings happened, and that is clearly there were serious flaws on both sides. Now, then you get the questions: how can you absolutely ensure that the right questioning and everything happens so you don't get that problem again? Yeah, and you put the oversight. But that's the direct answer to your question.
One of the questions I did ask was, how did this programme come to be? Was it an idea that came within BBC and then they thought which company could execute it, or whether they could do it in-house? This idea came from the company. So it wasn't a question of subcontracting, it's a question of commissioning. I can have an idea, I can try and sell it to the BBC as an idea, and that's how commissioning works.
As a general, you got to the heart of this. You said there are unanswered questions. So what we want to know is, was that because the questions were not comprehensive enough and not followed up effectively, or was it an active deception by this production company on their part to give you misleading answers?
I've got no evidence of the latter, but that's part of what we need to do in the review.
So as it stands, that's still a question? Absolutely.
Well, we just need to get into the detail of exactly why those questions weren't answered.
But isn't it important as well, I mean, to answer Rupert's point earlier, is there a way of making this film safe, that it can be seen by everyone so they can make their own minds up? I mean, from what I've seen, there's an 11-year-old Zakaria who helps paramedics at Al-Aqsa Hospital in this film, who does that rather than staying with his family because his family haven't got any food or water. And he says he's seen 5,000 people dead. That's an 11-year-old. That's not the narrator of the movie. That is actually one of the people in the movie. Surely that's a valid voice to be heard by the BBC licence fee payer if it can be done in a safe way. Surely it's possible to edit this film so you remove the narrator, in other words, the point of contention, and you still allow the children's voices to be heard by everyone. Then the licence fee payer can see from themselves what they make of it.
Certainly we, as I said right at the front, there was absolutely legitimate journalism to be done here, and the voices of those children and children in Gaza is absolutely something we need to hear, and that's what makes it, frankly, frustrating to where we are. You're going to get the same answer from me because it's appropriate, which is we need to do the work and understand the questions and then make that decision. There are clearly considerations here, and we've got to do our work calmly in the midst of, as I say, ferocious noise around us, by the way. I just want to say one thing, which is I just want to reinforce that the vast majority of our journalists are doing a tremendous job. So, but we're only as good in this job as, the weakest link, as it were. And this is damaging, but I do want to say that overall trust in BBC News, and we've seen some, it remains very high. We've grown it over the last year. Sorry, it's important we're not losing all context here. This was a serious failing, but we have trust numbers that we're very proud of. We're the most trusted brand in the world. And part of what we do to earn that trust, and believe me, it's never an easy day, is actually be highly transparent and go through enormous processes when we fail like this to show how we're going to fix it, and we're very transparent about that. And I think that is part of our process.
Very quickly, and then moving on to Paul.
I don't know if it's a view I share it with Paul, but personally, if to conclude on this is to redact the original programme, I don't support that. I think in the interest of transparency, we should see the thing as it was supposed to be and how it went out initially. You could, of course, self-redact and choose to emphasise and hear different aspects of that testimony, and I absolutely concur with Dr. Shah's point about the validity of seeing this war through a Gazan child or indeed an Israeli child, and I look forward to that documentary being commissioned. But I don't think this is about redacting.
It is about, sorry, it's really important. I agree with the thrust of that. It is about whether something meets our editorial guidelines and our standards. End of.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
about a position on either side. It is about whether it meets our editorial standards. And part of that is the making of the programme, not just what's on air. And we need to go through that work.
Okay, good. We need to make some progress now. Back to Rupert, please.
Sorry, it made me think, would you ever do a documentary? I think Al Jazeera, I've not seen it, but I've been told about it, did one with body cams of IDF soldiers, of some of the things that they captured.
There's not an area of scope which I say we wouldn't make a documentary on it. It's a question of what the editorial controls. It doesn't look like the easiest compliance journey, that one, but I think we would absolutely. We report without fear or favour, and we want to get to the truth. So the answer is we'll look at any proposal, or our journalists are out there looking at those kind of. I mean, the issue is where editorial control sits. And, it's worth saying part of the challenge is here, obviously, journalists on the ground in Gaza and what access we've got, making sure we're not being minded, all those things are really fair concerns. So it just depends on the situation.
I mean, I do tend to think that international news is often a bit flavour of the month. So we're talking about this at great length. Yesterday, I think there was an aid blockade in Gaza. That doesn't seem to have been on the evening news yesterday. I heard it on the Today programme in the morning. It's very Ukraine at the moment.
I think we're doing a great job on our coverage, and I think there's appropriate prominence, if I may.
And so, for example, you put me in touch with BBC Bangla. I asked when I came back, could I go on Dateline UK and describe that? The programme's been axed. So I do feel there's a shrinking space for international news, the way that you've restructured your news channels and things. But look, my last one was really about domestic political bias, and you know that I've questioned you on this before. I think my point is really, when politicians appear, if we go on TV, we're captioned with our party label, and that is transparent and clear. But on some of your panels, I know you always say that we've got a team in Question Time who's scrupulously fair about this, but we know from not just Question Time, any questions, Politics Live or Daily Politics, whatever it's called, you often get these right-wing Tufton Street think tank people, and that's not totally clear. Or you get owners of right-wing print media. The print media in this country, again, is shrinking. Every day you do the papers, you hold up the headlines, 70% of those are right-wing conglomerates, Murdoch, the other one, whatever it's called, the Rothermere one, whatever it's called. So, sorry, I can see you smirking, Tim. Is this amusing?
You've got journalists in the... Just keep going. Apologies.
If I've been
it was just a minor surreal moment. Apologies.
No, but for example, okay, we have a working population in this country of 33 million. 6.5 million of those are trade unionists. I raised this last time. Why do we not have trade union leaders? That is 20% of our workforce. Those people are absent. We know that there is the Spectator-funded GB News. Indeed. Often, licence payer money is used to create these culture war type scenarios where you take contributors from GB News, give them a platform on your panel shows. When can we have a bit more balance on your panel shows? Ofcom says in a modern democracy, people should have access, citizens should have access to a range of views, and it seems very skewed to the right.
I think we're working extremely hard. I thought you might ask me about Question Time, and I asked in the new series where we are. Labour 17, Conservative 17, Lib Dems 8, Reform 3.
It's the non-party people
bear with me if I may. Loosely, people of the left, if that is a descriptor that still holds, or people of the right, 11 each, and so-called neutral 7. I can provide the data. We're working extremely hard on this, and I think our record speaks for itself.
So whenever it's an academic, it's Matt Goodwin. He has known views.
But I can give you the. I'm trying to be. Trying to be led by the data.
And also from 2014, it's doing a statistic from this committee. Between 2014 and 2023, 5 journalists appeared on Question Time most. Do you know what publication they're all from? The Spectator. So I mean, it is a very
I just think we need to be. I
One-legged
think
chicken
we need to be led by the
balance.
data. Simple as that. Oh,
Right, that
data
data,
is-
I want to move
your
on.
data is different to ours.
If you can provide us with that data, we'd love to have it. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Let's keep with you, please, now, Paul.
Can we shift on to local radio stations?
Of
Obviously,
course.
you've had major cuts to local radio stations. You have to make savings in recent years. Have you now got an up-to-date assessment of the impact of that transition from local services from radio to online?
Indeed, and I thank you for the question. As we know, it was a very difficult period as we moved money around within the local budget. As you know, and you're well versed on this, we didn't take overall money out of local; we kept it cash flat. I think I'd pay tribute to all the local teams because it's been extremely tough, but it was the right decision to keep all 39 local radio stations in England. Do make those changes in afternoons and a few other programmes which have been difficult. The specific answer to your question is we've seen pretty much flat radars this quarter. I remember that question last time, which I would come back and give you that. But critically, in online, we've seen very significant increase, so about 40% increase. And the reason is, and this is why I was so obsessed by this, and it was not easy, is we were only producing a very, very low number of local online articles a day. We now produce a reasonable amount. The 11 investigative teams are beginning to pay dividends as well, and hopefully you can get on the ground as committee members and see their work, because it's really impressive. So I'm very proud of the local work. I wish I'd had more money and kept everything going, but I think us moving money around, and it was very difficult. This is the joy of the BBC. Local radio is precious, but moving money around has seemed to have delivered good results for us. The other thing we've made work, which I'm proud of, is if you go to our news app now and you're logged in, you get your local news right up there. And that's made a big difference to those teams, and their journalism is being seen by more and more people. So, yeah, I'm bullish about it. I wish we had more money for local. I think one of the biggest questions we're going to get to the Charter is what is the right provision for reporting locally, because we know how stressed the business models are of the commercial operators around us. And I say that with no glee.
I want to press you a little further on that. The Local Democracy Reporting Service has obviously been a success in many ways, and it fills the gaps where a lot of local newspapers have sadly died. I say this as someone who used to work in a local newspaper. But you've filled the gap. However, there's an increasing demand for that local news precisely because of devolution. You've got more combined authorities, you've got more elected mayors. Are they being scrutinised? They're spending billions of pounds of money, not central government, but locally. So there's a need and a demand for more of that local democracy reporting service. Are you anticipating in your charter review sort of bid that actually you can expand that service?
I think it's definitely one of those things we need to... We're a bit early, but of the 165 reporters, thank you to them. I think they're doing a tremendous job. Overall, it's a very positive readout, but there are things to learn in terms of just how they spend their time, how we make the journalism flow across the system, who's using it, is it getting through the bigger commercial players to the smaller commercial players. I think we need to look at all of that from a positive perspective. I would like to see, as part of the Charter, an upweighting of local provision, in terms of how that works. Now, whether that is LDRS expansion, looking at other things we can do, I think that's absolutely the heart of the Charter. I welcome ideas on this, because I think there's a number of views, by the way, on how you tackle that.
Yeah.
And our vision is not for the BBC to be the only show in town.
Yeah, thanks.
David,
Chair, I
and
would
then
like to just add.
very quickly, yes.
Very quickly. Local radios, you talked about my sitting on the fence. Local radio, I sat on the fence because I said I did not know. Since this last year, I've been to local radio stations, Nottingham. I've understood the difficulties, but as Tim says, my answer now would be it's been a real success. Not only because we have responded to the way people are increasingly consuming this, which is online, and the figures show it, and there was some difficulty in getting people, journalists, to move so that their output went on all these different platforms. I talked to them directly, and there was some difficulty, but now, when I spoke to them, they were really happy with the way it worked. It always is the case, isn't it, that people work in silos, and when you try and change that, people are resistant to it. But I do think now, my answer to your question was that was a proper move to be made, and I'm entirely supportive of it, as the BBC is, because it not only fits in with our strategic move from lit to digital, but also about the way it's been carried out and how it's strengthened local radio.
We love seeing you off the fence, Dr. Shah. Damien, and then Natasha.
So speaking of consuming things online, obviously you love it when people come to the iPlayer or to your website or to some other owned property, but there is a continued growth in consumers going for news as well as for entertainment, to social media or to news aggregators. And truth is, when you ask them, where did you see this? They don't say, oh, I saw a very nice BBC clip which appeared via Apple News on my phone. They say, either I saw it on Instagram or I saw it on my phone. So brand, ironically, in this world, is more important than ever, but it's harder to spot. And even when your brand is projected, actually it's also relatively straightforward to mimic, to directly or indirectly to copy the house style and to get this brand flattening effect. So my question to you is: do you see this as a big issue, and what do you do about it?
Huge issue, a bit of an opportunity as well.
Okay.
Yeah, because obviously in the midst of that soup you just described, where disinformation is rife, coming to the bit, we're seeing actually more of this, people coming to verify or coming to these services on the BBC and say, and time spent maybe.
Yeah, but these are, in the scheme of things, people who say I'm going to go find BBC Verify.
With respect, our news app is Solus news app. Our news app is bigger than Apple in the UK today. Bear with me. Our usage among 60,
right.
We're by far the biggest news brand.
So look, and BBC One is still the biggest single. It's still the biggest single vehicle.
Even among 16 to 30.
But it's a minority.
Even among 16 to 34s, we're being used. We're 70% of the 16 to 30. Now, if that sounds like complacency and defensiveness, I apologise, because it's not. I think there are significant risks in this area, very significant risks, and then they're multiple. And all I can say is we're working extremely hard on mitigation tactics and thinking through these things daily. On the brand, good point. We've got quite a lot of research now about, as we go into TikTok or Instagram and we put short form content out there, what gets remembered, exactly what gets remembered as the BBC.
Yeah.
How do we make sure that that's clearly attributable to the BBC? And we're learning that. And also, how do we link? Do you want more of this? Link across to BBC. And what we need is help on this, because linking through to those, cross-linkage is really important. There are certain services where the algorithm rewards those things with advertising in it. Is that something where, this is more kind of your side of the fence rather than mine in terms of what kind of regime we want in terms of protecting these things. We are also having to act aggressively where we see our services either ripped off or distorted. Yeah. I have the highest regard for Apple, and I mean that. They are an outstanding operation, but their summarisations, an interesting word, but summarisations where they were merging our headlines together was clearly not ready to go, and led to not just, distortions, but falsehoods. So I was grateful to them when I wrote to them at the highest level that they withdrew that feature. We're going to be going through this, I think, repeatedly. We are absolutely of the mind that the BBC needs to be out there on those platforms, setting the record straight, doing our work, but we're also tracking kind of really in great detail what brings people into BBC News. I'm a little bit more optimistic than the pushback you gave me, that you can go into those environments, get absorbed in it all, but sometimes you say, I just want to know what's going on, I'm going to come to the BBC. And I don't think that has to be a minority sport. It may not be quite sitting down in a chair to watch a half-an-hour bulletin, but it may be you want to go across, and maybe it's not vast majority of your consumption and good for a competitive market, but it is absolutely trusted.
Well, to be clear, I'm optimistic too. I'm certainly hopeful, because I think your role is more important than ever it's been.
Just to add to that, I'm going to just add to it. I think you identify something that we are quite concerned about, is the platforms on which people now consume material. Yeah. And we need to make sure that the BBC is available on those platforms, and a term we may come to, and that we're prominent there. These are really matters for regulatory control. But I can't emphasize how important that is. The algorithms that are currently driving, there are two types. One that drives you to particular content to make sure we're part of that. The other is algorithms that create content and we may come to that, because the creation of content, fake news as we call it, is going to become bigger and bigger. And as I said right at the beginning, we really do need to think very hard of how we can make sure that BBC News continues to be prominent and available to young people, to people who are going to consume it, not sitting at home watching television. It's really important.
So on a related but different question about the business model, can I suggest that in a parallel industry, so in the music industry, there is an enormous revolution moving away from physical format music, and everyone thought this industry has been changed forever. And then it turned out it was only temporary, because what had happened was that downloads had replaced physical format. It wasn't a stable equilibrium, and then streamers came along and changed the industry all over again. Because the difference between what's streaming in telly and streaming in music is that in music you have a small number of intermediaries through whom you can access everything. You don't have a different streamer for BMG or Universal or whatever. Whereas in telly, at the moment, you've got these walled gardens of content. And I just wonder if you think that really is a stable equilibrium, or if eventually you will have the same sort of structure as in music, where from whatever your way in is, you can access everything. And if so, what are the implications for the BBC?
Good question, big question. I think there is no doubt there'll be further consolidation. I can't see a situation in which, and scale is going to be defining in this. I think we're a little way off what you might say, what you might call a position where you don't have the editorial, the strength of our brands, if I may, unlike the music industry. Netflix has a position, the BBC has a position in a way that BMG or Universal don't, and they've chosen that. So I think it may well be that my forecast would be in the medium term we're going to be into fewer players with these big portals. You'll also have services, great services like Sky, that can bring them together, and search engines across them. So I think it's going to be a bit. I think it's going to be a bit of a blend, rather than a situation where you can just get at program level. We certainly believe that the curatorial power of the BBC say, look, this is what's on iPlayer, this is the news rail. We want to hold on to that, and I think that will hold up for some time.
But if I may ask one more, it is going to be lightning quick. All the things have changed in viewing and listening habits over the years. One of them is kids having their own, well, it used to be their own tellies, and then it became their own screens. And one of the things we've lost is watching things together. And I just wonder if you think that is a trend that could ever be reversed, and if it's worth reversing.
It's definitely a trend. With heavy heart, I don't think you can reverse market trends so much. Having said that, when 11 people sat down on where I was and watched Wallace and Gromit, it was a particularly precious moment on Christmas Day. So I think what you'll see is, and we're seeing as the BBC, whether it is an FA Cup match or a final of traitors, these coming together moments are becoming more valuable. So there's a trade-off between time and value, and I think it may be we're not all going to sit in the same room watching the same programs. If we come together, those moments are going to be incredibly important, and the feedback we get from those moments is off the scale in terms of people feeling reconnected, dare I say.
Very good question. So you're off the block. Natasha.
Just on behalf of all parents everywhere, thank you for Wallace and Gromit that got us through a long Christmas break brought us all together. But just back on this sort of view around new audiences and new platforms, just a couple of questions around the thing you said about linking back to the BBC. How are you ensuring you're extracting enough revenue from that content that gets placed on, say, YouTube? Because it might be on YouTube, it's still BBC content that's taken BBC money to make. So how are you extracting it, making sure you're getting value for money in that case? And if you can't link back out of the walled garden, what can we, is there levers we need to be pulling to allow you to do that? And the second part of my question, it feels like to me, the idea of sort of terrestrial versus new media and social media, that's starting to blend out, right? Now social media is just media. And if that's the case, when we talk about things like editorial bias, we talk about things around content having to be unbiased, like on the BBC. do we need to start looking at these algorithms and ensuring that they are less biased, and that actually we look at the weighting of those and see if we need to be trying to insert that sort of editorial balance that we see on things like PSBs on certain platforms?
That last one, let's start in. That's a very, very big question on whether you want to regulate and right. So I'm not, honestly, I think as leading the BBC, I just need to make sure the editorial standards and editorial, what we produce is absolutely to that standard. I think it's been incredibly important to have our regulatory framework around news and fair and balanced news, and we see in other markets where that's been abandoned, and the consequences from a societal point of view that leads to. So that is a political choice in some ways and a societal choice. From the BBC person's point of view, I just need to make sure that we can talk. I suspect we won't get to prominence, I don't know whether we will, but that is not something we talk enough about. Remember, one of the reasons why we have a successful, functioning UK-based media market is we have Channel 1, 2, 3, we have the public service broadcasters. One of the biggest things that's going to happen is not actually just on funding and all the various things we talk about. It is the implementation of the Media Act and Ofcom's recommendations later on in the year in terms of prominence. It is essential, to your point, that we get served up and we serve the public up with trusted news. And just to be clear, and now linking very quickly, if I may, to the front end of your question, is if an algorithm prioritises those things that can deliver most ad revenue, which is logical from a commercial business, that is another prominence consideration, not just what is on your big screen, as it's now called, in your living room. Yeah. So I cannot underemphasise the implications of what, we wanted significant prominence in the Act. We're very pleased with the Act, but we wanted significant prominence. We got appropriate prominence. What appropriate prominence is probably one of the biggest things we're going to do in the next year in terms of the future of public service broadcasting.
Let me just add to that, because I do agree that prominence is very important. I just take us back to how, in a previous era, we secured prominence on the EPG. That was an act of political will that BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, Channel 4 were there. Really important, because if we'd been left alone, we wouldn't be there. BBC One might be number 246, it would just be lost, PSBs. I think it's really important that as we move to our digital age and on demand, that we have through regulatory mechanisms equal prominence to PSBs. It's so important, because if they're not there, we've already mentioned that endless
really
rails.
important.
Where are we? And it's so important.
Very much.
So,
I'm going to move on to James now. Thank you.
Yes. What was the BBC? What was your response to the government's consultation on AI and copyright? Are you an opt-in or an opt-out kind of guy?
I've never been asked that question. We actually think, if I can just do a quick general one sentence at the top, which is, I think the opportunities to deploy AI into the BBC are significant and exciting. And I certainly don't want to be dragged there. We're already piloting AI, but we want to do AI for good. This is a choice to intervene. Everything we're talking about is a choice to intervene, and we should not be dragged into AI. So we're not, that would be a disaster for us. So I am now working with the big AI companies on pilots. I can give you examples of where we're deploying AI to further our good impact. There's obviously this separate related question about scraping and taking, and I think that there is a really clear thing for us, and you've seen the letters that numerous media owners have signed, as well as people who are contributed IP, is we, the British public, own this IP, and we believe we should be paid for it. That's it.
So you would say what to a government that's considering all things re-copyright?
Well, I mean, we in that sentence is the broadcasters and a number have written a letter which is very clear, saying we do not believe that we should go to a regime where and this is not head in the sand, this is not saying we shouldn't involve change or development, or I'm very interested in national libraries of AI. I think when it comes to charters, all kinds of things we can do to deploy AI for good. I'll give you a little teaser on this. Think about education. Think about the fact that social mobility in the UK is so painfully low over generations. Could we use AI to help with personal tutors for everyone, regardless of their economic circumstances. All of those things are exciting. But what I don't think, to the point, is, and you can read the letter, I can share the letter. The letter is very clear. It says, do not scrape the data. We believe just an open scrape where you can just take everything, take all the AI, and then build valuable business off it. I can see the argument, but I don't believe there can't be a way in which you can get some value back. And you look at the situation we're in, which is we need a bit more money, to put it mildly, for UK PLC and its creative industries. Surely there must be a way of doing this sensibly, which is not, restricting innovation in the way that's being characterised, I think, in a quite binary way.
Because one of the best things you are as an asset to the creative industries is that you're the lead or a lead within an ecosystem of creative content.
Correct.
Content creators. Do you see your role as, is there a bit of a duty to help protect them and their livelihoods? Very often middle earners, very often quite patchy hit and miss work experiences or work streams as well.
Of course. We need to be accretive to the creative industries, and we're not wholly about making a profit. That's the commercial arm only. We're about offering value. So therefore, we can make somewhat different decisions, and there's no judgment in this, also no negative judgment to commercial operations in terms of where we're geographically based, how our money flows, but what you need is a fair return on that. And I don't think it's Luddite to say, if someone's made something, and that we should work a way of doing that. It is difficult. I just say it's easy to opine in the way I've just done, because I've got the tension between letting 1,000 flowers bloom and create the value, but once you've created the value, there must be a way in which you can attribute it back. Now that could be through the entities themselves or through the flow to the IP owners, but there has to be a way.
Thank you.
We agree. Thank you. Zoe.
Thank you. So looking to the future, we've obviously got this massive shift going to take place in the 30s, moving to internet protocol television. Start of a 10 question, what are the BBC's priorities when it comes to that transition to IPTV?
Not leave anyone behind. We're a universal broadcaster. We've done it before. I remember I remember someone saying, they'll eat their hat if we can do a proper DTT, I won't name them, DTT transition, and we did it. And long-range planning, proper process, we can all see the benefits of making sure that everyone has access to digital services. There's broader benefits than the BBC here. There's societal benefits, all those things. And television can be a first way in which people can be taken into a new technology. We've done it in our history. But just to be clear, we've got no appetite to a position where people are left behind. And I think Ofcom's work on this is helpful, the options they've given. What I would say is just digging in purely on DTT is not where the BBC is. The BBC would like to be part of a proactive transition of the UK to a fully digital, fully digitised households, or what, if that's the right word, but digital households, so they can get all our services, and people are using those services. But there's got to be a lot of work. There's got to be a lot of help for those who want to get from A to B on this. There's also the economic questions of, what's the right provision in terms of those people who are really on a tight budget or don't want to change. Exactly.
And on that specifically, obviously we've got the whole conversation about funding for the BBC. Who do you see is responsible for paying for the interventions necessary to make sure that, as you put it, everyone comes on that journey together?
I think we should be responsible for making brilliant programming and communicating how our services work. I definitely don't think we should be paying for a switchover in that way. That's just not what the licence fee is paying for.
Thank you. And just briefly touching on DTT, there's a whole conversation around whether you continue to have DTT beyond 2034. If it needed to continue for a period, what are the cost implications to you of providing that?
Well, they're not good. Certainly a full fat DTT is something I think we have to decide and ensure that we're not running two very expensive distribution systems, because you're just soaking that would be hobbling us. Yeah. There are low cost options, as you know, the so-called, I need to get into a bit more detail on this. That's not an offer. I need to get into more detail outside this to get a bit more on potential nightlight options and things that are being talked about. Sorry.
I was just going to add that the BBC's had experience of this before with digital switchover, and as it happens, I was on the main board of the BBC when we did that. And we were very conscious, as the board will be now, that we don't leave people behind, and we manage it. And I remember the moment we switched off, and there was always a small group of people we could manage, but the direction of travel is clear. People are going to move to on-demand and IPTV. So I think there's a lot of institutional knowledge of how to manage this in such a way that we just need time to reduce the number of people who can be left behind, and then be a matter of judgment when we decide we've done as best as we can, and then it's the switch. But it is something that we're very concerned about, because we are a universal service.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Let's now move on to Liz.
Thank you, Chair. If I could ask Dr. Shah, what is the status of the Change Associates review of workplace culture you commissioned following the Hugh Edwards court case, and when might it be published?
Thank you for that. This is really a very important matter for me. If you were to ask me, I've been here a year, and what I wasn't expecting was this procession of men abusing their power, from Hugh Edwards to the most recent thing. I am determined to stamp this out. We commissioned Graham Russell and Charlie, Change Associates, to look into that, and I've been talking to them regularly, and I've been reporting back to the board, and the board has been taking it. So we are determined to do this. Right now, they are working on it. They've done all the interviews, done all the work on it. We're now discussing what actions we're going to take. I'm also very keen that it's not another set of processes. I actually want real action, visible action, that demonstrate that if you step out of line, we can enforce it, and that something is done. One of the things that seems to me a theme of all the reviews that have taken place is that junior staff feel disempowered to call out more powerful people behaving badly. We have to find a mechanism and a system that allows them to do that. Unless, that they don't think their career's at stake. They don't think somehow they're going to be moved out somewhere else. That they don't say, well, actually, we can't, because this person is more powerful than me, and the management would say, oh, well, why don't we just move this person out? Those are practical things we need to do, and we need to do it, and we need to enforce it. Now, the report will come to the March board for final discussion, and will be published during April. At that point, I will personally take ownership of this and talk about what we're doing. I feel very strongly about this. It's not right. The BBC of all should be setting the example. I'm very pleased that Baroness Kennedy has started up the CIS thing. We're heavily engaged with them. We want the whole of the creative industries to be involved. But we should be setting the lead, and we should do that. And I will own it, and I will speak about it publicly once the Graham Russell has produced it and it's gone through the board mechanism. We're looking at the board in March, and then in April for publication.
Good. We've spoken a lot about trust today. Have you been able to recover any salary from Hugh Edwards?
We have not. I think Tim may ask. We've obviously asked, and we've said it many times, but he seems unwilling to it. There was a moment that we thought that he might just do the right thing for a change. Clearly decided not to. Tim, have you got any more on it? I don't think we've heard, you see.
And there's nothing you can do to
I don't think
compel
there's
him
legally
to give that back the money?
No, we've made the request, and we've looked at taking legal advice. That's where we are.
It's quite frustrating, this, really, because you think... I think he should have done it. He could still do it. It's not right. He's taken licence fee payers' money, and he knew what he'd done, and he should return it now.
Can you give us examples of what actions the BBC has taken as a result of recent high-profile cases of misconduct?
Yeah, there have been a number of specifics. Remember the recent case, the Tim Westwood case. Tim Westwood was about 20 years ago. Russell Brand was also quite a long time ago. Tim Westwood was over a long period of time. Russell Brand over more specific. There have been specific processes that have, in response to particular cases. that's not to say we've fixed the problem. Even though we've responded, and Tim can spell out the responses we've made to our, but we have yet to fix the problem. Now, it may be, you could say to me, would we ever fix the problem, given the profound nature of it? But I think we could do a lot more. But Tim, you could spell out
very
what we've actually done.
And this, I think, let's just do the process and the culture, because they sit beside each other, and I think you can hear that we've faced these major issues in this industry. I don't think we're totally unique, but this abuse of power, we want to finish it. And I've said very clearly to the organisation and where we're at, we're all of the people that work across the BBC. And I want to touch on indies because I think that relates earlier to, because I think that's really important, the work CISA are doing. I think where we've made real progress on a number of fronts. Firstly, versus those historical decades-old cases, we often, a couple of things were really clear, which is you often had things raised up and they just kind of stuck in their silo. We now have a specialist case management process that there's, if anything serious or even anything coming across through the BBC, it is joined up and gets referred up. I'll come to the need for someone to raise it through whistleblowing, or because that's the point, if they need to raise it. But if it's raised, we are not in a situation that doesn't get visibility across the BBC and it's taken seriously. And if anyone's got examples of that not happening, that is a absolute grade one issue for me, because I don't believe that happens. We've got anti-bullying and harassment policies. We've standardised our complaints process. And in our latest research, about 70% of staff feel comfortable to raise issues. Now, I've got a mixed reception in my mind, as you can imagine, which is 70% is better than, I could parade out industry norms where we're better than most places. But that means 30% still are not quite comfortable enough to. So that's where I'm healthily dissatisfied in that. I think we are therefore encouraged by the Change Associates Review is another chance not to push enormous amounts of process, but make sure that I'm particularly interested in the practicalities of what actually happens on the ground with a line manager when you see something. How do you raise it? I think this is where the industry's really got to get to. Get that confidence level up to call it out. And also there are things that you hear that may be described as banter or other things. Let's be honest, that culturally things change. Which you don't quite know, is that something I want to raise or not? So I think we've done this in other areas. I think we need to give people more help on that. Is just be very clear, we've got zero tolerance. But we are taking action whenever we see it. You can see, think about the individuals. They're not on air that we've had recently. We're not tolerating this. But that's only as good as making sure on the ground it's working. The vast majority of the BBC, and you're welcome to come anytime, open access to see, talk to leaders, talk to employees, talk to staff, talk to colleagues. We're proud of the way the BBC works, but we've had these instances, and it is to do with how power is abused. That's it. And we need to address it. It will be, at the Change Associates, I really want practical guidelines, and that's what I'd ask of the work, for line managers and building confidence among teams just to never tolerate even something that they can see as marginal they raise.
So are you confident you can stamp it out?
Yeah, I think you can never, I want to be realistic, you can never ever be in a situation where you can say one rogue individual who's doing something, potentially using their BBC kind of status and abusing it outside work, which not all these instances are the same. Yeah, these are not all instances of, we've had things in our past that are really horrendously grim in terms of cover-ups internally. The Westwood Review found no, predatory sexual behaviour. It was bullying and misogyny that wasn't referred up and joined up. That is very, very serious, believe me. But what I would say is you can never say, organising 23,000 people and all the freelancers, that you're never going to have issues beyond the BBC. What I can say is we can get to a point where I think flawlessly we say zero tolerance, and also you're catching stuff very early. You're never accepting that someone is abusing power in the workplace. I think there's something quite profound about no one being indispensable, if I may. I think you can get into a situation where, and this may be, you can think of other areas, banking, health, where you'd go, that person we can't live without. And part of the review work is to make sure that everyone is clear that that is no longer ever acceptable.
Can I add to that? Because you've heard that I've taken personal ownership of this, That's partly because I'm aware of it. I've worked on program making, and I know that I've dealt with presenters who are quite full of themselves. Let's put it that way. And in some ways, I mean, they're talented. But because we work to make them good, there's a kind of cultural issue. They become more and more full of themselves and start behaving badly. What we must do, we can never control how people behave, but what we can do is to empower the staff and change a culture. So no matter who this person is, the BBC is bigger than them. We can live without them. Right? And I need to bring about a change within the culture of the organisation, and genuine where junior member, middle manager say, this person out. We can do that. We can do that. We can't control individual human beings where they want to abuse things, but if they do, by God, we can make them go. Because we are bigger than them. The BBC is bigger than them. The history of the BBC is we have loads of people presented and we make them stars. If they misbehave, out. We can do that.
Thank you. Paul?
Dr. Shah, you started by saying one thing you were not expecting when you took over as chair of the BBC was to have a year full of succession of allegations about workplace misconduct by men. I mean, my question to you would be, where have you been for several years? If that wasn't
no,
your
it's more in terms
expectation?
of what I was. If you were to ask me what would be the board agenda last year, the first thing that came up was Hugh Edwards. Then there was Jermaine Genius. Then there was Strictly. Then there was Greg Wallace. Then there was. I wasn't expecting that. It's not that I've worked in this business. I know it. But what I was just talking about, the extent to which it just kept coming and coming and coming. And admittedly, timing, some of this, when I first arrived, I was told in March, this time last year, the Russell Brand report would be coming out. It's going to come out in a couple of months' time. Then Tim Westwood report was going to come out. These are old reports. They've been commissioned, but they've all landed in my first year, is what I'm saying.
I get that.
I mean, I listened live to the Russell Brand story, so of course I knew about it.
Sure, and I accept the Director General suggests that things have improved in terms of reporting processes. But Director General, you did talk about that 30% who still perhaps don't feel safe working for the BBC, that you are worried about, rightly.
It's comfortable.
Comfortable,
It's an
okay.
important distinction.
Comfortable, but within that there'll be some who don't feel safe, I imagine. Now, you're right, you pointed out to the Tim Westwood review, which was produced last week, a cost of £3 million, I might point out, a long review, in-depth review. One of the most worrying findings in that independent report was that those who were effectively on the wrong end of Tim Westwood's behaviour said there was, quotes, a feeling they could not raise issues with the controller or other people in senior management because of the importance of the talent to Radio 1 and Radio 1 Extra. Now, Mr. Davie, you were director of audio at the time. Do you take any personal responsibility for that culture, the fact that those staff felt that they couldn't?
Of course I do. I don't want people to be in workplaces where they feel they can't raise issues. It's not my style. It's not how we should work. And I think if people were... You can't, when you're doing a job at director level with thousands of people, be on top of everything. But at the end of the day, if that person would have the exec producer and the controller, and if they didn't feel that confidence, that's the problem. Of course it is.
You think that's changed?
I think, yes, I do think, I honestly, because we've got a joined up system where you've got whistleblowing, you can go beyond that. I just think the data says we've changed. Now, you're only as good as your weakest link, so I think there's constant vigilance in terms of where culture is not working properly. But certainly, the way I am talking to the top 300 leaders of the BBC is absolutely, I think, in a completely different place to where we were years ago. But you're only as good as what you're delivering. And I think, to the chair's point, this year we've had a number of instances. Part of it may be a reflection of just us moving now to a world in which some of this stuff is just unacceptable in terms of what was lived with. And some of it might not be criminal activity, but just frankly stuff this is completely inappropriate for a workplace in 2025. And I think people have been thinking, is that something also, do I raise that? How does that work? We're being very clear on that. I think the Change Associates report will help that as well.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Rupert, did you want to come in on
Yeah, I
that?
just wondered what happened to the report Banijay commissioned into Greg Wallace. It was the end of last year.
They're doing their work, and we're waiting. We're hoping weeks, not months.
Okay, I'm curious to see. Yeah, they instructed a solicitor, didn't they? Again, there is an
Well,
issue about
once you
do
do these things, there's a question of scope, and once you do these things, you've got to do them properly. So they've got to talk to everyone and make sure there's nothing.
But they've instructed a solicitor. It's not an independent inquiry.
As
They're paying the solicitor. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a Banijay-led inquiry,
And it's not concluded yet.
and it's not concluded yet.
Thanks, Rupert. I mean, I think that your point, Dr. Shah, is that there have been these people who are often referred to as talent, who are effectively the gods of television, not just at the BBC and other scandals on other channels, who almost felt that they were untouchable. They could behave how they wanted to, and in and outside of the workplace, and they were beyond anybody's power or control because people didn't feel they could report bad behaviour. Are you saying that no one is untouchable now, in sense of, there's no talent too big that...
Talent. There are powerful people behind the screens too. They don't have a right to abuse. No one is untouchable. No one is bigger than the BBC. No one is bigger than us determined to sound. It's really, really important. It's 2025. We can't have this kind of behaviour and find it acceptable. It's certainly true that looking at Tim Westwood's behaviour, that would not be possible now, but there are others that, we just have to make sure that the BBC is a modern organisation. People who work for it feel able to voice their concerns if they have any, and that they will be dealt with, and that no one in the BBC is untouchable.
Everyone's dispensable. Everyone's dispensable.
Good.
That's the message.
But I mean, we have had situations in the past, with this was not in any way a reflection of the behaviour, but more of a conduct outside in terms of tweeting and what have you, people like Gary Lineker, and the whole system sort of closed around him. But I mean, are you saying that situations like that are also, he was almost, Gary Lineker almost too big for the BBC to fire him?
Well, no, I don't, when you say the system closed around him, some of the other presenters felt that he had been mistreated. Yes, so it wasn't the system. I mean, the system was saying, working its way through under my leadership. Honestly, I can never say you're never going to get into situations as you deal with this industry and all the various things. But I think where you can say, to the earlier question, is we can wipe out within our workplace has that standard and it's non-negotiable. We haven't touched on, by the way, which I just want to say, which is also in independent productions, because it is really important to the early, to Banijay or the various these issues. So we want to make sure that people are fully compliant with the CISA standards before we contract them. So that is going to be.
And this goes back to the due
important.
diligence issue that we were sort of talking about a while back.
Yeah.
I mean, this is due diligence is with regard to the behaviour and how members of staff and freelancers are treated. So are you confident, given that there's been a sort of a massive due diligence issue on quite a seminal issue, are you confident on individual matters like this?
Well, I'm confident, but I think we have to be healthily paranoid and just constantly make sure that work is being done. I think CISA are helpful. Those standards give it an architecture to, if I'm meeting with the head of an indie, if I'm a commissioner, I can say, let's go through this. We need to make sure that work is done. Okay. I think the truth of this is, in terms of building people's confidence, I can see why that issue can be even greater when you're just a freelancer with vulnerable in terms of level of workload. Raising an issue could even have a bigger consequence for you than being part of the BBC as a permanent staff member. So I think that's a really
more questions. We want to just rattle through them with you. James, I'm going to move on very quickly to bio, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is probably a question for both yourselves, Dr. Shah and yourself, Tim. You mentioned earlier that the BBC is a trusted brand, and which I concur with as well. It's a national asset. That was another term used. And then you also sort of referenced around the sort of the appeal, the trust within the news category from 16 to 30-year-olds as well, which is really important. So I suppose what I wanted to sort of talk about is the sort of the targets around the diversity. I say that because, and this is not necessarily a question asked just of yourself. This is very much a societal matter, and the BBC is not on its own. So I make that clear. But certainly, because it's a national asset, I ask that question, which is, where do you feel you are heading with regards to your diversity targets? Because the strength of any organisation is the people that it reflects, and if you're talking about the BBC and its appeal, it markets and it presents to all of society. So it needs to be reflective of society in terms of its workforce. And so I'd like really to hear from both of yourselves, really. Where do you feel you are with regards to your diversity targets?
Okay, I'll let Tim give you some data answers to that, but let me first of all respond. I think diversity, we need to unpack that term. I think what we mean by diversity is a much more sophisticated understanding of that. I mean, in the past it used to be a kind of euphemism for talking about people of colour, but now we understand it's not just that. We're talking about class, we're talking about thought, we're talking about regions, we're talking about geography, all sorts of conversation, and because that's what the country is made of. We're talking about neurodivergence as well. So I think the point you made there is absolutely vital, because the BBC must look and sound and feel as if it belongs to the country. It can do that if it reflects those diverse ranges of geography, of class, of points of view, of ethnicity, and gender, of course. And I think it's a sine qua non. If we want a charter, if we want to exist, if we want to be a universal public service, it has to do well on these fronts. It can't just be a group of drawn from a narrow world, because it actually doesn't make for good programming. Better programming, you get better outcomes. I say that with my board. I have a board which has lots of different points of view, and that helps discussion, helps debate, and it's much better all round. And we're doing well on that. I think we're not doing as well on all these different fronts, but Tim can tell you where we're doing well on and where we still need to do work on.
It's a critical issue, and I think getting diversity. There's been a lot of debate about diversity, hasn't there, in recent weeks. But this idea that we represent those we serve, and make sure that the BBC is not. I think there's vulnerability around groupthink. That's always been my issue around impartiality to a degree, and that might be socio-economic diversity as much as other types of diversity. In terms of reshaping the BBC, the direct answer to your question is we're making significant progress, but I remain dissatisfied on a couple of measures. And I set some pretty clear targets and goals, I should say, in terms of 50, 20, 14, 25. And goals aren't everything. It's about how you belong in an organisation, it's about the senior leadership, but as a starting point, I wanted to at least be reflective of the society we serve. Where we are today is more women work at the BBC than men for the first time in its history. So we're basically 50-50, just over 50. In terms of black, Asian, minority, ethnic, I think we're at 17.2%. We've seen that grow over the last few years, but critically also in senior management roles. Because I think if you can't see the senior leaders coming through, that's an issue. And that has changed significantly, so we're seeing growth in those areas. We can share the numbers are published and we do. The next area, I think the area we've really got to keep work on is a 14% target around people with disability. We're around 10, I think, but I think that we could do more work in that area. And then the really intransigent one, which cuts across everything, which I'm fascinated by and challenged by in some ways, is socio-economic diversity. So if you look at parental occupation at 14, it's basically, there's 100 ways of describing it, but this is not a bad one. I think it's about I'll have to get you the exact number, but mid-30s for population. We're at, I think when James Graham did his speech in Edinburgh, he said the industry was 15.5 or whatever, something like that. We're at 20.6. And even when I'm very proud of our apprenticeship scheme. Just for information, we had 46,000 applications for 290 jobs this year, which puts the industry in perspective. Even with that, it's quite difficult because people feel about the vulnerability of joining the creative industries, potentially all the risks around that. They're not making that leap and saying it's for them. So to answer your question directly, we're making lots of progress. We're changing the leadership of the BBC. I'm proud of the work we've done. I remain restless in a couple of areas.
Brilliant. Thank you, gentlemen. Just one last question. You mentioned sort of the diversity of thought, Dr. Shah, regional bias, or regional representation, should I say, disability, and you mentioned socio-economic. I think those are really important. I think certainly my question wasn't just around ethnicity, and so you both answered the question, I felt, appropriately. So how comfortable are you with regards to your sort of 1,000 apprenticeship target, you know, and how we can make sure that all those different types of people, all those different voices, all those different regional thoughts, all those different abilities work their way into your apprenticeship targets, because, you know, that will have an effect on your future outlook and your productivity as an organisation.
I think we're up to 1,400 have come through the whole programme. We're currently got about 900, I think. I'd have to give you the exact. I'll write to you with it. I can give you the exact number. We're doing well. We're doing well. As I've said, I think the recruitment has really worked extremely hard to make sure we've got a diverse, in all that means, range of people entering the BBC. Also, the diversity of thought is important.
Yeah.
So if you think about institutions, connecting how people think, making sure there's no assumptions about even mainstream thinking versus also. Yeah, I think we've really got to be careful. I'm worried about institutions detaching from those that they serve.
And thank you for that. And my one last comment, you mentioned about sort of senior management, you know, representation, which is key, because obviously the talent, the apprenticeships, all of these people coming through need to be able to see a path for them, a journey for them within your organisation. If they don't see leadership, they then move on, and so you lose that talent as well.
That's absolutely right. I've looked at some of the apprentices, and I think they're beginning to address this point. I mean, all these different areas, like a metropolitan point of view rather than a town, that's really important, that people are drawn from these, because we need to guard against the idea that we have a recruit from the metropolitan world, not just London, but other metropolises, that they're arts graduates. You know, this is the media after all, so it tends to recruit people. So we need to guard against that. And I think apprenticeship is a really good way of going out there and really applying some of our criteria to make our workforce diverse and to monitor, so that, as you rightly say, they go up and wield executive power, that they come up the system and they don't just walk out.
Thank you.
Very important points.
Thank you, Bio. Just two very brief ones before we let you flee. Rupa.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned gender, because that's another issue with these lopsided panels. Fiona Bruce, when she came to Ealing for Antiques Roadshow, did say, I'll give you that, there's not enough women on our panels. But look, my last question is going to be, despite the BBC's requirement to have at least one BAME candidate on the shortlist of every open position, at regional leadership level, how do you account for the fact that there's only 5% BAME in those positions and your own target is 20%?
When you say regional, what exactly do you
so
mean?
For example,
do you mean
not
local?
a single head of region is of colour. Not one single TV editor in the BBC regional television is of colour. Of the investigations unit that got closed down and was so controversial, not one head of these teams is of colour.
Well, I just think we've got more work to do. There's not the numbers I gave you are overall BBC, so they're true. They're true. They're good. They're really good. It's really good progress. So I think
those top levels.
But that counts. Which is, and I think I've made this point that if you can't see yourself in the leadership, you don't believe. You just don't believe. So we're about 14%, I believe, at last count. Overall of black, Asian, minority ethnic leadership, senior leaders. Okay, that's a big, that's not where I want to be in the long term, but it's a big change. There are specific areas where the amount of change in the candidates coming through is going to take a bit longer, and you've just identified one. So I take the challenge. I think it's a fair pushback, and we need to really keep trying to make those changes. There are examples of people coming in through that area, and I can think of a couple that are doing a good job, but we need to do better.
And just on that, we find that female sports commentators, it's about protecting people from the abuse that they're likely to get as well, right? So female sports commentators come in for just the most phenomenal amount of abuse, particularly on social media. I mean, is there anything that you can do as an organisation
to protect,
support, prepare?
We're providing support to individuals. We're working. I mean, this is broader than, if I may say, just female sports commentators. That's particularly toxic. But journalism, journalists, female journalists, people coming from any kind of minority, it's vicious out there. I don't need to tell you. So it is vicious. We need to call people out, but we also need to, i.e. people that are doing this. But I can only say we have got quite a lot of support systems in place. We are working hard on it. We're having to do more. If you take people that are working in the area of disinformation, and you can think of a few people in our place that have been in front of committees and things, they are getting enormous amounts of abuse. So I thank you for the question. We are providing lots of support. We probably could do, or keep being restless about giving more support, and recognising that, and also calling it all out together, because it's just unacceptable in terms of a functioning democracy, frankly.
Yeah. Finally, Natasha.
Just finally to Dr. Shah. In November, you gave a speech where you talked about the speed of Ofcom's regulatory processes, and you called for regulation that helps rather than hinders in a changing media landscape. So how would you change how Ofcom regulates the BBC?
How would I?
How would you change how Ofcom regulates the BBC?
Well, I would invite them to be quicker than they are. They understand. Look, Ofcom's regulatory processes were developed 20-odd years ago. We now live in a completely different landscape where the world is moving very fast. Audiences are changing their consumption habits very fast. We need to move quickly. The example I gave, that we, after the first time over 20 years, we saw some extensions to our radio services in the light of changing audience behaviour. It's taken the public interest test, it's taken over 15 months to get one thing approved. Meanwhile, our competitors, within a month, launched 15. This is really unacceptable. Ofcom need to understand how fast the world is moving and how we need to move with it, and we're not suggesting not having regulation to make sure that we don't crowd out the market. Just do it quicker, because it's just taking a long time. You will remember, and I remember because I was again on the board at the time when, rather brilliantly, the public service broadcasters launched an on-demand platform called Kangaroo. Ofcom killed it because, the competition would crowd them out. Now look, we are fighting to keep up. Ofcom need to understand the world we're moving in, the pace at which it's changing, what we need to do, maintain our universality and our reach and our accessibility, and allow us to do that without just wading through treacle, getting this done.
And just
again, be clear, I think we should be regulated, but the regulatory system needs to be more agile.
And just finally then, so have you been working with Ofcom on the implementation of the Media Act? And have you got any concerns about their approach to that process?
Well, I know the team have been, as Tim's already said, we're particularly concerned about significant prominence, because the Media Act says appropriate, but which is not good enough. We need to be significant. All of you who will know to have smart TVs, think of how long it now gets to get to public service. We need to have significant prominence. But there's been a lot of conversation.
We're in conversation. I think the Ofcom team are very strong. They know their business. We just need to get this work done at speed.
Good. Thank you very much.
Can I just say, Chair, can I just make one point, which I've never done this before, which is an area we haven't covered, which is the World Service. We have only got a one-year deal at 137 million, and that runs out in April 26. And I just want to put on record that I think becomes, with the opportunities that we have and the rest we have, I see it as a grade 1 issue. And if we're covering the board of the BBC, the mass of the BBC, we haven't covered that today.
I was going to cover it if we had time.
I understand that, and I'm being
I'm
just being interventionist in terms of saying
okay.
I just want the committee to note that, because for us at the BBC, in terms of our business, the questions in terms of supporting, which are well versed among us as a group. I think, remember that with pressures on the budget, the movements in the budget, we have 137 million. That's just to keep the show on the road, let alone proper investment. So that is coming up in the next, if we think about our business over the next few months, as we go into the spending round, that'll be a big topic.
Are there any implications of the government's decision to change the foreign aid budget?
We don't know, but I would suggest it's probably more, it's probably not positive in terms of just the pressures on being able to fund the World Service appropriately. We must keep, you know, in our view, we must keep the 137 million coming. We want more than that, but that's a bigger topic.
And may I just also indulge me to make another thing that I'd like to ask the board. Maybe we can discuss it next time, and that is about the charter. When I outlined in Leeds, I said I was looking for a charter for at least a generation, if not a perpetual charter. That's a really important statement about the independence of the BBC and what the charter contains and why that is what we want to go for. It's, again, we can have regulation under a framework agreement, but I think we need a charter for the BBC that we're not constantly reviewing our very existence. And it would be good to discuss this at some point in the future, because it's really important that that is examined and discussed and debated. And it is something you'll be pleased to know I've already made clear what my position is.
Well, when the charter review process begins, we will start our own work, and we'll very much look forward to welcoming you and your colleagues back as part of that. So I very much doubt you'll have to wait so long until we have the pleasure of your company again. But it was great to see you both this morning. Thank you very much for your time, being very patient with us. We've gone about half an hour over, so I hope we haven't made you late for anything else. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.